Hey, this is Seth Tichenor with Philosofarian Mailbag. If you have questions, you can contact me at Facebook or YouTube. I have a question here from iCosmo for Shots. I want to know the reasoning behind picking and choosing what to believe in. How can someone say in one breath their sacred book has it wrong on one issue, yet in the next assert that it is right on issues that they happen to agree with? Well, the thing about this letter is it has a couple of pretty big assumptions in it. First, it assumes that all sacred books or texts are literal. And secondly, it assumes that these books are instruction manuals of some sort. I understand how people might get that idea, but I think it's a little bit misguided, and I want to reframe the issue. What exactly is a sacred text? What exactly is literal interpretation? What exactly it is to interpret something metaphorically? And then I want to offer a way in which you might approach the interpretations of sacred texts generally. Sacred texts, what are they? Well, obviously a sacred text is a kind of religious text, but that's not all there is to a sacred text. There's plenty of religious texts that aren't necessarily sacred texts. Gospels of Jesus, sacred. Thomas Aquinas, religious. Torah, sacred. Moses Maimonides, religious. The Vedas, sacred. Sri Aurobindo, religious. I would say sacred texts are unique, and there's two particular features that make them unique from all of the religious texts and really from all of the texts in general. A sacred text is actually a kind of invitation to participate or commune with a particular vision of the cosmos that is understood as the way the world truly is. The sacredness comes from the fact that there is an invitation within this text to pray, to ask one to be obedient, to offer a revelation, something that brings you in a certain way. Set within the narrative tradition of practitioners, the community of the faithful, and it's usually set as the cornerstone of it. Right? So the Bible is not just an invitation of all sorts of practices and beliefs to participate in. It's an invitation that is at the center of that community. When you talk about a literal interpretation, you are talking about an interpretation in which the meaning derived from the text has a direct correspondence between the grammar, the language that you're using, and the object. That meaning is discrete, and that meaning is fundamentally unambiguous. People have this idea that literal means actual or true, but that's not necessarily what it means as far as interpretation goes. In order to interpret it within a text literally, that object that you're talking about in the text has to be finite. Finite. There's three basic parts of metaphorical interpretation of the text. First, to interpret a text metaphorically means that the meaning is derived from the text is emergent from conceptual parallels that are drawn or exist between the objects in the text. Instead of saying there's an object there, it means that I'm drawing a direct correspondence the way you do with the literal stuff. Instead, there's different objects that are talked about, different things, and there's a connection. There's a set of activities or parallels. Your mind draws connections between those things, and from that, the meaning emerges. Second part of metaphorical. Meaning derived from the text is interpretive and evocative between the interpreter of the text and the text itself. The interpreter has to look at it and draw out the possibilities of it. It's a little bit like the way in which a chef who might be making a lovely soup has to take all of the ingredients and draw out the flavors of each and every one of those ingredients in order to get that soup, that bisque, or whatever he might be making, to work. In just the same way, the interpreter of the sacred text, who is interpreting it metaphorically, has to look at the objects within the text, that things that are talked about within that, and consider them in a way where they evoke the meaning that's within it, evoke the conceptual parallels that are emerging from it. You might get the idea from what I've been saying about metaphorical that metaphorical interpretations are private or subjective or relativistic or something like that. Think about a metaphor is, it's the interpreter and the text and the object and all of them negotiating together. There ain't nothing private about it because it's a three-way thing. So, not the same thing. A metaphorical interpretation is not a subjective interpretation. Third, and finally, the meaning of the interpretation, metaphorical interpretation, is ambiguous. And what I mean by that is that there's many different possibilities to it. Now, that doesn't mean that any possibility is right and all things are equal. It's not. All I mean by ambiguous is that there is more than one possibility to it. What we've got then is we've got this idea that a sacred text is an invitation to participate in a vision of the cosmos that's centered at the fulcrum of a community of faith in some way. We got the idea that the sacred text can be interpreted literally, in which there's a one-to-one correspondence, or it can be interpreted metaphorically, in which the meaning of the text is there's connections made and it's evoked out and participated in. Here's the question I have for you. Is it even possible to interpret a sacred text literally and still have that interpretation be coherent? Can it still make sense? The problem is that trying to use language that is literal is trying to use something that is fundamentally limited in its application. You're dealing with something that is sacred. You're dealing with something that is the ground of the possibility of being, the fountain of meaning in the world that we know. How literally do you talk about the grounding for the condition for the possibility of the real? I don't know what that is. I don't know not only how to do it, I don't even know what it means to do it. And you're going to give an interpretation of the sacred. No matter what else you're going to do, you are going to have to use a metaphorical interpretation and evoke meaning out of it. You're going to have to find a way to participate in that meaning, and you're going to have to get used to the idea that you never exhaust the meaning from that. So, Cosmo, to respond to your question, I'm afraid I can't give you a direct answer to that, but I can explain to you why I can't. The very nature of these questions, in order to be authentic and meaningful, has to be answered by the questioner. You have to answer it for yourself. Given that we can't talk about sacred texts or interpret sacred texts in a literal sense meaningfully, there's not just a thing there to get, I think the best that you can do is try to do that well and deeply, and you can ask other people who are looking at these texts why they approach it that way. Because there's no delineation of being able to find these things out. They're simply too deep. It's just the nature of it. If there is anything I can offer you, it's a little bit of advice. Remember that symbols really are going to have to be whole and wholesome in order to be functional in your interpretation. And what I mean by that is that these symbols ought to awaken and engage the practitioner to new dimensions of spiritual life. That there ought to be ways in which when you read these symbols, you have a sense of inspiration. There needs to be a way that the symbols are living, whole symbols, and that they give a rich and vital dimension to spiritual life. If they don't do that, you're not doing a good job. Second piece of advice has to do with the narrative tradition that you're working with. Whatever it is, it needs to be intricative and humane in the way that it does these interpretations. And what I mean by that is, if you go to a church or a mosque or a community of people, if the way that they read this text is exclusive and cuts other people out, it calls some people inhuman and says some parts of the world just aren't really parts of the world at all, if it's bigoted, if it's cruel, it ain't working. It's failing as a sacred system. Because anything that cuts reality out of reality is a contradiction, and that's what you're looking at there. Something that you have to remember within all of this. Literal truth is not the only truth. A literal interpretation is not the way to get to the truth of a sacred text. I know I've been pretty hard on literal interpretations of sacred texts in this. That way of trying to approach the text ultimately leads to a contradiction. There are other ways, deeper ways, to get to the truths within sacred texts. If you find someone who's insisting on a particular point of view, inquire, ask what their reasoning is, what the truth is as they see it. How do they put that together? Why does that work? Dig deeper and deeper. And if you do that, I think you're going to discover dimensions of this truth within these sacred texts you didn't even know were there. So that's it for Philosofarian Mailbag. Got any questions, comments, thoughts, you want to talk with me? You can get me at Facebook, on YouTube. I wanna change the world. I change the world. I wanna change the world. And if you really liked what I had to say today, a few philosophers you might be interested in looking up yourself. William James, Paul Tillich, Rudolf Otto, Ramchandra Gandhi, Harold Oliver, Elliot Deutsch, Soren Kierkegaard.